Hello, Patreon people. It's been a while, and I'm doing a reading tonight, so I thought I would kill two birds with one stone and actually rehearse by recording what I'm going to read tonight for all of you that can't make it tonight. Hi, Sandra. So this is a story set in Serendib. If you're not familiar with Serendib, it's this weird little city formed in the intersection between many dimensions, some of them magical, some of them scientific, some of them other things. And I've written a whole series, I think 6 or 7 of these stories now. The first one was for actually this anthology, Blackguards. And if you're familiar with it, it's the story The Subtler Art, starring an assassin named The Dark and her husband, Tarichatus, a wizard. When I first wrote that story, I wanted to write about sort of middle-aged or older adventurers who had retired. Since then, The Dark and Tarichatus have come back several times. None of these stories seem to be more than 2,000 words. I'm not sure why. All right. Having been one of, The Dark said, stressing one of, just enough to show she was only being politely self-effacing by including it, the finest assassins in the multiverse. She had learned that word from her husband only last week when he was pontificating about the extra-dimensional nature of the city in which they dwelt, and she took a certain delight in displaying it now. I feel it essential to establish the distinction between assassin and thief. The conversation this time was another of the interminable bar discussions that often take place in the city of Serendib. Situated and composed as it is of a multitude of realities, its citizens are able to approach philosophical issues from a variety of viewpoints. This time the participants were The Dark, her husband the sorcerer Tarichatus, her oldest friend and enemy, Chig, the rat god, and an unnamed woman who none of them knew but had wandered over from another, presumably less entertaining conversation, and was listening in without introducing herself, a little rude, but not outside the bounds of Serendib courtesy, where often the silent have a reason to be so. If there is a distinction, and I'm not agreeing one exists, it is surely only a matter of degree, Chig said. He had introduced the topic on purpose in order to irritate The Dark. Thieves steal from people, and what is taking a life but a form of that? You are trying to annoy me, said The Dark, having found unexpected directness useful in the past. But Chig was not to be diverted so. That is an interesting way to deflect my question, he said. Tarichatus cleared his throat. I have found 2 things, he interjected. One is that such things are often a question of how a person thinks of themselves. The actions of a thief in a situation may be very different from those of someone styling themselves an assassin. He took a sip of ale. And the second, The Dark prompted, but Chig interrupted before Tarichatus could reply. Then we should be able to put someone in a situation and determine whether they are a thief or assassin by how they act. Tarichatus opened his mouth anew, but this time the nameless woman interjected. You're saying that if I'm thief or assassin predicts what I do? That seems easy enough to put to the test. The Dark peered at the woman with interest. Are you one or the other? She asked. I am, said the woman, but I will not tell you which, in the interest of science. The Dark's eyes narrowed, but she nodded. Tarichatus said, but if you know it is a test, you might change your answer. Now you are growing overly complicated, Chig said. Let us think of our test situation before we concern ourselves with that. What do you propose? Chig stroked his whiskers with a thoughtful paw. We certainly have The Dark as our baseline for who is a better example of an assassin. He gave The Dark an oily smile that she did not return. She was feeling a trickle of unease deep inside. Chig was fond of long, hidden machinations, and The Dark was reasonably sure that this one was his cat's paw, so to speak. She looked over at Tarichatus in one of those moments of unspoken marital telepathy that they shared from time to time, and he shrugged at her, meaning, wait and see. This could be a situation that calls for an assassination or a theft, but that would seem a bad choice, Chig mused. Therefore, something outside either realm, and yet still a trifle unsavory and outside the law. He stroked his whiskers lovingly once again, setting them in perfect order. The Dark decided that supplying her own factor into the situation would surely change it up enough to disturb Chig's plans. She did not wish to be predictable, and she and Chig had known each other a very long time indeed, and so she discarded the first notion that came to her, and then the second, and then even the third as a precautionary move, congratulating herself on the acumen displayed therein. She said, gambling in the form of the beetle. Oh, there's something that's going to trip me up tonight. And said, gambling in the form of the beetle bets. She was pleased to see what she interpreted as a flicker of annoyance crossing over Chig's face, although rats are notoriously difficult to read in their expressions, and that he took care not to look at the woman. That seems fair enough, Tarichatus supplied. Very well, Chig said in a sullen tone. The woman nodded, and they paid their tabs in order to exit. What is your name? The Dark murmured to the woman as they made their way towards the door. Victoria, the woman said, giving her a little smile, flirtatious as a wink, charming the Dark despite herself. She was a very pretty woman when one looked at her, with long black hair as lustrous as though it had just been brushed out, and eyes the same shade, made even darker by the long lashes surrounding them, reflecting slivers of light from the colored signs pulsing behind the bar. The Dark leaned over to her husband and murmured in his ear, Does she have charms laid upon her? He shook his head at her and she frowned, but kept moving nonetheless. The beetle races are illegal in Tibet because they alter the laws of chance itself. And that is a very risky thing there because so many things depend upon those laws. Such events are here held near the great coffee roastery that always, or usually, sits on Serendib's southern side. The aromas wafting from that establishment and all the consequent nearby coffee shops hides the acrid smell from the race battles that would otherwise force Serendib's law enforcers to notice their presence on occasions other than the pre-scheduled monthly raid. The world of the coffee roastery is assuredly a pleasant one. The trees around it are tall and leafy and laden with lemons almost as fragrant as the factory's product. In their highest boughs, alkits nest, the progeny of the ones in the nearby brewery, who will spread even further with passing generations. But go further up the street and the puddles grow oily from a constant acidic mist, shifting to cobblestone slippery underfoot. The buildings change to fungal, pallid, and flabby structures that must be grown anew every few months. The Colosseum that holds the beetle races is an immense puffball, its massive, warty outer walls sprayed with fixative to hold them in place, flammable as fireworks, if not for the constant rain on the other side. Stands held the watchers, and in the middle an immense round of violet and green marble, perhaps 10 yards in width, like an enormous lazy Susan on which the beetles crawled, and in its center a black sphere filled with stars. Despite the number of people there, at least 100 gathered into the wooden stands, silence held, and the only sound was breathing and the ticking of the legs of the great hand-sized beetles crawling over the round. Each beetle wore around its neck a tiny basket woven of silver wire. Surrounding the round were the beetle brats, who constantly removed or slipped tiny glass beads into the baskets of the beetles, marking the bets, while their juniors ran back and forth between them and the crowd in response to wordless hand signals. Tarichatus breathed in the Dark's ear. You know that it is possible here to lose one's luck entirely, and that is not something I can cure easily with magic. Her only response was a sideways flick of her ebon eyes and a quirked lip that told him that, although he had no clue what it was, she held some plan. And this is why we look at pages ahead of time, because this hasn't printed this out all the way. Victoria stooped to one of the vats by the entrances and took a handful of beads, as did the Dark and Chig. Tirikitis refrained, although he gave the vat an uneasy glance as they passed on their way to the stand, noting the way the beads held 1,000 colors, the manner they seemed to roil of their own volition under his gaze, as though urging themselves toward him. They began to bet. The beetles crawled and clacked on the marble round, sometimes meeting to mesh mandibles and attempt to push each other into the great black round. 2 perished in this fashion, the loser pulling the victor in after it, and several faces in the crowd paled or flushed or looked about for ways to escape before a beetle brat came to show them towards a booth at the back. They gave all their beads to a single beetle brat. That means we all win or lose together, you know, Chig said in question to the Dark. I am familiar with the rules, yes, she said. He shrugged, and they turned their attention back to the game. How many hours passed while they watched the beetles? How many beads went from one basket to another, then another, or went spilling down the void in the center? How many times were the guttering lamps near the doorways replenished? Dawn was tentatively touching the doorway's edge by the time they stood, a beetle brats filling each hand with a clump of beads much smaller than originally, and moved to the booth to cash out, the only way to know who had won or lost. I am not sure what any of this has proved, Tirikitis muttered. He had grown to the age where a sleepless night was not as effortless as it once was, and tiredness gnawed redly at the corners of his eyes and etched lines around his mouth. The Dark, who appeared untouched by the night's rigors, shrugged. They stepped into the reckoning booth. It appears we've lost our luck, Chig said in pretend shock. Indeed, said the Dark, and yet I was prepared and brought my own to substitute, so I have lost luck pre-purchased in the market. Ah, said Chig, then it will be sad to tell you this was all a trap, and I swapped out ownership of the markers through certain arcane preparations, and you have been saddled with twice the loss, and us, both of us, with half. He bared his teeth in a grin. Ah, said the Dark, that would be sad had I not refrained from doing the same. Chig started to say something, then stopped. What? You were about to tell me you had anticipated that move, were you not? The rat god frowned and nodded. Anticipated. And since your co-conspirator did not do the same, she shrugged. She is a thief, and not the same as an assassin, and hence I have won the argument as well. An entertaining evening, for which I thank you. She bowed to Victoria and Chig with elegant satisfaction and took her husband's arm, smiling. As they walked home, she said, when all of this started, you said you had found 2 things, but you only told us the one. That is true, Tirikitis said, and yawned. And the other, she pressed after a few more steps. He tilted his head to examine her. I am not really sure you wish me to say. She frowned. Out with it. As I said, one is that such things are often a question of how one person thinks of themselves. The second thing I have found, Tirikitis said, rubbing his nose, is that such things usually matter only to oneself, and realizing that may save one some sleep. And after that, the Dark was silent all the way home. All right. There you go. I hope that was enjoyable. Thank you for seeing what it's like to read a story through cold, and you can see why it's probably a bad idea to do so. I noticed several places that I'll tweak. I noticed that I had left off some lines, or rather the printer had left off some lines, which is a good thing to find out now rather than during the reading. And the other thing I wanted to say about readings is that it is okay to edit a story a little if you want to make it read better out loud. That is perfectly kosher, and I say that with assurance because Stephen King does it. And so Stephen King does it, it's okay. All right, so there you go. I'm off to a reading soon. I hope this was enjoyable.